Yeah, it's uh, that part of my life has taken over. So it was really interesting, actually, to look at something completely different around Entonox, because my experience of using Entonox was as a mum, and my youngest is 35 years old, which is why I know how long I've been qualified, because I finished doing all my paperwork whilst on bed rest with hypertension, as you do. So I used it then, and I also used it when I broke a wrist a few years ago. So I know from a mum's point of view how valuable it is. So when Sue first asked me to look at it, I'd already been aware of all these headlines, um, which, if you were a mum about to deliver at the time these headlines were out, I think you would have become quite anxious, because you'd be thinking, well, I'd always thought gas and air and a natural birth would be okay, but all of a sudden it's being taken away, and it's not an option. So it must have been quite terrifying. But I think it was also terrifying for midwives, thinking, well, we've been using this for the whole of our lives, and now everybody's saying that it's dangerous. So, is that true? Is that true? It wasn't until yesterday, when I first met Catherine, that I realised I've quoted the journal article that she's written. But I've been working with some anaesthetists doing some information, and it was quite a shock to me to realise that anaesthetic gases make up 5% of the carbon footprint in an acute hospital. I've been doing a lot of work on climate change and breastfeeding, and saying, breastfeeding is wonderful, it stops the carbon footprint. And yet here we are, we turn it all round, and we're destroying the ozone layer. And 1 kilogram of nitrous oxide has the same effect as 298 kilograms of carbon dioxide. Those were quite alarming statistics, something we hadn't thought about. We think about climate change, we think about our cars, we think about smoke, we think about power. But had we thought about something that we regard as part of normal life within a hospital setting? So King's College Hospital found that most of the waste came from the piped manifold systems. And actually, only about 88% of what was purchased was actually used clinically. So we were wasting 92% of something damaging the ozone layer. And that actually local small cylinders, as Sue said, the ones that we kind of grew up with, would drastically reduce waste. And how easily it can leak out if seals have deteriorated or demand valves are left open. So it's going back and looking at the way we use it as much as what we use. So Entonox, to a labouring mother, is something that she can focus on, something that makes her breathe, something that acts as an anxiolytic. And most women would consider just using Entonox would be a natural birth, and something that a lot of us have strived for, and I know my kids did. So going into labour, it's something you want to know that it's there, that it's straight away available to you whenever you need it. You don't have to wait 30 minutes for an on-call anaesthetist to come and put in an epidural or for painkillers or anything else, and that there's no evidence of it causing any harm. So that it's not only okay in labour, it's okay in breastfeeding, it's okay immediately postpartum. So something that we maybe love and trust. But it was in relation to its occupational impact that we started to be more worried, and how much of a negative effect was it having on staff. So using doubling masks were more effective than scavenging tools. That's lovely. Most places they don't exist. And that there's some degree of cracking technology. But these are all things that we probably don't have, because the NHS is strapped for cash to make these changes. So what can we do to make it safe for midwives and for mothers and still produce adequate pain relief. That's got to be our gold standard, hasn't it? So the COSH risk assessment came out in March 23. I had a lovely time. I fell asleep twice trying to read it. And it talked about environmental ventilation and local extract ventilation, which I assume means opening a window or having an extractor fan. But things like where you as a midwife are relative to the mother. But I think as most midwives, you tend to be next to the mother, reassuring her. You don't want to be at the far end going, it's okay, dear, just carry on. You're doing very well, dear. It sounds like more like something out of the midwife. You've got to be there. You've got to be close, because that's what midwifery is about, isn't it? You're being with mother. That's the definition of midwife. But we do need to be aware of this risk assessment, and maybe we need to revisit the training issues around the administration and look at how we can keep ourselves safe and what to look out for. All the references that are at the bottom of the screens in green everywhere are all on the reference list that Sue has that she'll upload for you. And then I realised that nitrous oxide is going to is under the Psychoactive Substances Act, which doesn't sound quite like natural childbirth. And it's a Class C controlled substance because it causes the psychoactive effects, euphoria. And it's actually under this act, it's an offence to knowingly or recklessly supply nitrous oxide for its psychoactive effects. So all these people who are selling these little canisters at Glastonbury or whatever music festival or whatever party these people have been going to are actually causing a criminal offence, and that the government have actually decided that they're going to tighten up on this considerably and make it much more of an offence. So the Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire says they're bringing forward to control it under the Misuse of Drugs Act, and making it much more of an area for prohibition. Now, I do wonder how this is going to happen, if every rave is going to be policed for the nitrous oxide canisters, whether we will see slightly less when out and about, because as Sue said, on the run, wherever you go, you see these little tiny canisters on the floor. It's also been used for whipping cream in kitchens for chefs. So when it's used as an analgesic in labour, one of the things that we need to be aware of is that its effectiveness is reduced if the patient isn't using it properly. And what people often do is actually take the mask away from their mouths when they're exhaling. Now, I read this. I'm not a midwife. Having been on one end of the scheme is very different from you watching what's happening. So something to be aware of. And particularly if there isn't any particular ventilation going around, maybe we need to open a window. I always find midwifery units seem to be incredibly hot. And I know we need to keep the newborns warm, but sometimes for a labouring mother, you need to be naked for more than one reason. And I always worry about the poor dads who are up there. They're not fainting because of the sight of the blood. They're fainting because they're hot. But maybe we need to think about where we are and turning the gas off when it's not in use. So it's just being aware that there is a theoretical risk to us, but not all of the time, and it shouldn't impact on how you do your job. Because a lot of the data that we're getting on the effects of the exposure is actually about long-term, regular exposure, but to a level that is in misuse. So it's about memory loss, it's about vitamin B depletion, incontinence, weakened immune systems. But I don't think this is anything that we've ever thought about before. I've never seen a midwife ask me, is it okay if I'm using nitrous oxide? In my case, it's always because I'm breastfeeding. I have had vets ask me. One vet said that she was anaesthetizing a ferret, and the mask would not be able to be tightly sealed around the ferret's mouth, so there would be some leakage. So this is an extreme example. And would it be okay for her to breastfeed her baby that evening? I get these kind of really interesting different questions in my life. But it did make me think, in that situation, you would be noticing that you were drowsy or giggly, and that might not just be a sign of your exhaustion, which I'm all too well aware it can be part of your daily lives. Vitamin B12 depletion does seem to come up in a lot of the studies, and can cause neurological disorders. So if you think you have problems with your vision, your memory, pins and needles, it's probably a good idea to go and ask if you can have a blood test, so that it can reassure you that somebody is monitoring your B12, and that if it is deficient, then you can have a regular dose of vitamin B12, because B12 is actually poorly absorbed orally. So when we add it into multivitamins, then actually we absorb very little of it. There are reported problems with reproductive risks, but it seems to be largely in much older papers, when I suspect the COSH regulations were really minimal. And perhaps it's much more about non-legitimate users exceeding the current health exposure limits. So there can be congenital abnormalities, spontaneous abortions. If this is something that you're worried about, please go and talk to somebody. Go and talk to your line manager and see if your area can be risk assessed just in case. But the recreational use is going up and up in 18 to 24-year-olds, as it is a festival drug. It's not illegal to use it, but it is illegal to possess with intent to supply. And these are the ones who get the disorientation, the headache, loss of coordination. It all sounds a bit like being drunk, but much more readily absorbed, and you get the fun things of making your voice go a bit funny, and it's a bit of a game to play, and nobody's going to think that this is dangerous in the same way as we think about drugs of misuse and alcohol. So people who are using it regular long term may well have permanent problems. And there have been deaths because people have done stupid things like put plastic bags over their heads and inhale the canisters with a plastic bag over their head and actually suffocate. But we're taking the evidence from misuse and changing it into possible evidence in regular, normal use, which isn't the same thing. So my conclusion from everything that I've done is know that there's a potential risk, but don't panic unless you feel sick and dizzy after attending a birth, other than for exhaustion. If you want a blood test, go and get one. And I'm sure the health and safety everywhere are looking about risk assessments in the environment. But also remember, at the other end is a labouring mum who maybe doesn't want an epidural, or there isn't an anaesthetist available, or isn't somebody available within the time that she needs that painkillers, which is where the headlines came from. I had to give birth with just paracetamol. We don't want a crop of mums being over-medicated because a group of teenagers are using it for fun. I hope that's reassuring. I hope it makes sense. But I'd be really interested later on to hear your thoughts.